The panic begins. The skies above the Galactic Academy campus on Earth were clear in the morning when the alien students gathered for their field study. They were from many worlds, creatures with shimmering scales, soft fur, segmented limbs, and translucent skin, each one accustomed to controlled environments and carefully monitored climates. For them, the idea of studying on Earth, the infamous death world, was already a source of nervous tension. Yet curiosity had driven them here to learn what made humans endure on a planet so wild and untamed. The human student who joined their group was quiet, walking with the calm confidence of someone who knew every path, every smell in the air, and every sign the sky gave before a change came. His name was Thomas, and though he wore the same uniform as the others, the aliens always looked at him as if he belonged to a different order of existence entirely. As the day unfolded, the alien students inspected soil samples and gathered atmospheric readings with their equipment. Everything seemed calm, though one insect-like student kept glancing upward nervously, as if sensing something wrong. By mid-afternoon, the horizon darkened. A low growl rolled across the sky. At first, the aliens thought it was some kind of distant machinery, but the human lifted his head, sniffed the air, and simply said it was thunder. The word meant little to them, but the tone in his voice suggested it was expected. The sky grew darker still, and a flash of white light split the heavens, followed by another echoing boom. Now the students' antennae, frills and tendrils all quivered with fear. The first drops fell like liquid fire to the aliens. They shrieked and flinched as cold water splashed their bodies. For them, it felt as though the sky itself had broken apart. Sheets of rain began pouring down, heavy and relentless. The path they had walked became slippery and thick with mud. One scaled student cried out that the planet was attacking them. Another tried to activate a personal shield unit, but the water struck from every angle and seeped through. Their instructors had warned them that Earth had hazards, but nothing had prepared them for the violence of falling water from the sky. Some ran toward the nearby trees, thinking the wide leaves would offer protection. But the leaves bent under. The weight of the rain and the drop still splattered through. Others tried to huddle together, raising their data pads overhead as makeshift shields, but the devices shorted out within seconds. The ground around their feet became small rivers of rushing mud, and several of them stumbled, flailing to keep upright. Panic spread quickly through the group. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of fear, each in a different language, but all saying the same thing: they were not safe, they were under attack, they had to escape. Through all this chaos, Thomas stood quietly. His uniform was already soaked through, water dripping from his hair and nose, but his expression never changed. He watched the storm as if it were an old friend rather than an enemy. He knew exactly how long this kind of downpour would last and what needed to be done. To him, there was nothing extraordinary about it, but he could see the terror in the aliens' eyes. He stepped forward and tried to calm them, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of the storm. So instead of speaking, he bent down, touched the muddy ground with his fingers, and nodded to himself. The aliens had gathered in a shivering cluster by now, some trying to dig their claws into the dirt for balance, others covering their eyes with trembling hands. When they looked up and saw the human kneeling in the mud, they thought he had given up or lost his senses. Yet he moved with deliberate purpose, scooping away mud and carving shallow grooves with his hands. At first they could not understand why. Then they noticed the streams of water shifting, flowing into the channels he had made. The path around them began to clear as the water was guided away. Even in their panic, the aliens blinked in disbelief. It looked to them like some hidden technology was bending the storm. But it was only the human shaping the land with his bare hands. The rain hammered down harder, the thunder louder, the flashes brighter. But the human continued calmly, his shoulders hunched against the deluge as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The aliens whispered among themselves, their voices breaking with fear and awe. One asked how such a fragile creature could endure this punishment without protection. Another suggested that humans must possess some hidden adaptation, perhaps microscopic armor under their skin. All the while Thomas dug, water rushing along the channels he carved, and the aliens' panic began to change into confusion and reluctant fascination. By the time the first flood of water was redirected, the alien students were no longer running or screaming. They stared at the human, soaked to the bone but steady as stone, and a thought began to creep into their minds. Maybe survival on Earth was not about strength of armor or speed of reflexes. Maybe it was something else entirely, something harder to understand but far more powerful. And as the rain poured and thunder rolled above, that thought filled them with both wonder and dread, for they realized they were seeing only the beginning of what humans could do when the world turned hostile. Alien desperation. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the alien students found themselves caught in a nightmare that none of their training simulations had prepared them for. The water coursed down from the sky in endless sheets, turning the once firm ground into a sucking mire that pulled at their feet with every step. Their bodies were not built for this kind of environment, and the chill of the rain sent violent shivers through them. One insect-like student with delicate wings tried to shield herself by curling them around her body, but the water weighed the wings down until she collapsed to the ground, helpless. Another student with scales that gleamed like glass let out a cry of pain as the cold cut through his armor-like hide, making his joints stiffen. They were students of science, trained to analyze data, but in that moment every calculation fell apart as instinct took over, and survival consumed their minds. Some of the braver students tried to move toward the buildings at the edge of the field, study site, believing the academy's reinforced structures would offer salvation. Yet every step was hindered by rushing water that reached their ankles and sometimes their knees. The ground dipped in places, and what seemed like a shallow puddle became a small pit of swirling mud. Two students lost their footing there, sinking waist-deep before their peers dragged them free. Their shrieks echoed above the thunder, and the sight of their struggling forms only worsened the panic of the others. To these aliens, water was not just a nuisance but a force that could drown, suffocate, and erase them, and they began to believe. The planet itself was determined to swallow them whole. The human still worked steadily, digging with his bare hands and a found stick he used as a makeshift tool. The alien students shouted at him, demanding that he come to shelter, but he only shook his head and motioned for them to wait. His calmness in the face of what they considered certain death unsettled them more than the storm itself. They could not decide if he was mad or if he knew something they did not. Each time the water shifted into the grooves he carved, a few of them paused in their terror to watch, uncertain whether to believe their own eyes. For them, hydrological control was something that required complex machinery and hours of preparation. Yet here was a human doing it with a stick and sheer stubbornness. Meanwhile, desperation grew. The insect-like student with soaked wings screamed that the storm would never end. A fur-covered student wailed that the sky was breaking open and that soon there would be nothing left of the ground beneath them. One reptilian youth slammed his claws into the mud and tried to dig downward, convinced he could bury himself away from the storm. Others clung together under the largest trees, shaking violently as every new clap of thunder rattled their senses. Their instructors had not warned them about this, because to humans this was simply weather. Nothing more than an afternoon shower in the grand scale of Earth's climate. But for these young aliens, it was a cataclysm. The human rose from his work for a moment, his face streaked with mud and rain, and gestured for them to follow. His words were lost to the roar, but his confidence alone gave them pause. Against every instinct screaming at them to flee in different directions, a cluster of the students stumbled after him. They had seen the way the water bent to his will, and though they did not understand, they wanted to believe there was safety in his presence. The human led them across the sodden ground, choosing paths that seemed impossible yet always kept them from the deepest pools. He paused to redirect a small flow of water with the heel of his boot, and the aliens watched with wide eyes as the stream obeyed and cleared their way. Still, not all followed. Several hung back, convinced the human's madness would lead them deeper into danger. They tried to craft makeshift barriers with their equipment cases, stacking them high and crouching beneath. But the cases slid apart under the force of the rain, spilling delicate instruments into the mud where they shorted and died. When a sharp flash of lightning struck a tree nearby, splitting its branches and sending splinters through the air, those who remained screamed in renewed terror and began to run blindly, each in a different direction. Their panic only made them sink further into the mire, and their cries reached the ears of those who had gone with the human, filling them with dread for what might happen if they had not chosen to follow. As the human pressed onward through the storm with the few who trusted him, the truth began to dawn on them in fragments. He did not resist the storm or fight it as they did. He accepted its presence, read its flow, and bent his actions to suit its rhythm. The water, the mud, the thunder, none of it frightened him. He treated the storm as if it were part of daily life, something as ordinary as breathing. The aliens clung to him in disbelief, their bodies trembling and their minds racing with questions. What kind of species could live like this every day and call it normal life rather than disaster? The realization was more unsettling than the storm itself, and as they stumbled behind him in the endless rain, they began to wonder just how much else about humanity remained hidden from them. Human ingenuity appears. The rain pressed down on the field in endless curtains, and every alien student who followed Thomas could feel the weight of the water on their shoulders and the mud clinging to their legs. Their bodies were trembling with exhaustion, their lungs straining in the cold air that carried the metallic scent of lightning, and yet their eyes stayed fixed on the human who walked ahead of them with a strange calmness. Thomas moved through the storm like someone who knew every secret it held. He did not rush or stumble but walked steadily, pausing only when he saw that the water was beginning to pool in places where it could become dangerous. At those moments he would crouch down, thrust his hands into the mud, and carve shallow channels that allowed the water to rush away from the path. To the aliens, this act was nothing short of sorcery. They had never seen anyone control the natural elements with nothing but bare hands and instinct. The first time Thomas shoved his heel into the earth and created a furrow, the aliens froze in shock as they saw a torrent of water change direction. It was as if the human had whispered a command and the storm had listened. One of the scaled students leaned forward, his voice trembling as he muttered that perhaps humans were not creatures of flesh, but elemental beings disguised in soft skin. Another suggested that there must be some invisible technology in his boots, but when they looked closer there was nothing but worn leather and stubborn determination. Each new channel he dug looked effortless, but to the aliens it was as though he was bending the laws of nature. Thomas did not stop there. He picked up a broken branch that had fallen from a nearby tree and used it like a tool, pushing it into the mud to shape the flow of water. The branch snapped once and he tossed the fragment aside without hesitation, reaching for another. He was improvising, adapting in every moment, while the aliens had been taught to rely on rigid plans and machines. They began to whisper among themselves even as rain poured into their mouths and eyes. How could a single human know more about surviving on this hostile world than all of their gathered technology? The question gnawed at them, pulling their minds from fear into bewildered fascination. Behind them, the students who had refused to follow were now struggling even more. Their cries carried faintly through the storm, shrill notes of terror that made those in Thomas's group wince. One insect-like student turned back as if to run to them, but the mud sucked at her legs and she would have fallen if Thomas had not grabbed her by the arm and pulled her forward. His strength surprised her. She had thought humans frail, but his grip was steady and unyielding, his eyes burning with focus. He did not waste words trying to comfort her, for the storm was too loud, but the message was clear enough in the way he pushed onward. If she wanted to survive, she would need to keep moving. The group stumbled forward as Thomas guided them through the rain, and soon he led them to a low point in the ground, where water had gathered into a rising pool. The aliens froze, convinced that this was the end of the path and that the flood would drown them. But Thomas only set down his stick, bent his knees, and dug furiously with both hands, scooping away mud until he had made a channel leading away from the pool. The aliens gasped as the water obeyed gravity and drained into the groove he had made. In minutes, the pool had shrunk to a harmless puddle, and the aliens stepped across it wide-eyed, murmuring in disbelief. It was as though they had witnessed a miracle, but for Thomas it was nothing more than common sense and practice from a lifetime of storms. The fear that had consumed them only moments before began to shift. A student with luminous eyes leaned toward another and whispered that perhaps humans did not endure their death world through luck, but through mastery. Another added that perhaps every human child learned such skills before they could even read. The thought unsettled them, for it suggested that humanity's normal life was harsher than anything they had ever trained for. As they looked at Thomas, covered in mud yet still calm, They began to realize that what terrified them was ordinary for him. The storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the ground. But in the midst of it, the alien students saw something they had never expected. A human did not run, did not cry out, did not collapse under the weight of fear. A human bent the world with nothing but his hands and his will. They felt a new sensation rising within them, one that mixed awe with unease. If this was how a single human acted when confronted with what they considered disaster, what would an entire species accomplish when faced with greater threats? The question hung heavy in their minds as they stumbled behind Thomas, their fear of the storm slowly giving way to fear of the answer, the sloped roof secret. The alien students followed Thomas as he led them across the flooded field, their limbs heavy from exhaustion, and their hearts pounding from the strain of running through an environment that felt like an endless assault. The rain fell so hard it was like standing beneath a waterfall, the ground beneath their feet sinking with every step. Yet the human never faltered. He knew the ground, he knew the way the water moved, and with every stride he seemed to choose a path that spared them from the worst of it. The aliens had stopped questioning why he was calm, for by now it was clear he saw patterns in the chaos that they could not comprehend. They simply clung to the hope that wherever he was leading them would be safer than the storm tearing at their fragile bodies. At last they saw a structure rising through the haze of rain, a shed made of wood and metal, simple in design, yet to their eyes it looked like a fortress. Its sloped roof gleamed as torrents of water raced down its sides in steady streams. The aliens gasped as they realized the water did not gather on top but rolled off harmlessly, falling to the ground in curtains that never touched the space beneath. It was such an obvious solution that they were stunned none of them had thought of it. But then again, none of their worlds had weather that raged with such violence. To them this was engineering genius, yet to the human it was no more than the work of basic shelter. Thomas motioned for them to hurry, his soaked uniform clinging to his frame, his face streaked with mud. They stumbled under the edge of the roof, and for the first time since the storm began they felt relief. The air was still damp, but no water fell on their heads, and the ground beneath was drier, firm enough to support their trembling legs. Some of the aliens collapsed immediately, their chests heaving with exhaustion, their tendrils or frills pressed flat against their bodies. Others touched the wooden walls of the shed in awe, whispering that this structure was more valuable than any energy shield they had ever seen. The sloped roof, so plain and ordinary, seemed to them like a marvel of civilization. What unsettled them most was not the roof itself, but the way the human treated it. Thomas walked to the corner, leaned his back against the wall, and slid down until he was sitting on the ground. He stretched his legs out, crossed his arms over his chest, and shut his eyes as though preparing to sleep. The aliens stared in disbelief. The storm still howled. Thunder cracked like a war drum, lightning flashed bright enough to blind, and here was the human closing his eyes as though this was the perfect time for a nap. To them, this was madness, but to him it was comfort. He had food in his pack, shelter over his head, and no fear in his heart. The insect-like student with drooping wings whispered that perhaps the human was not mortal at all, but some kind of elemental spirit bound in flesh. Another fur-covered student argued in a trembling voice that perhaps humans were bred in storms, that their very blood carried the rhythm of thunder. Yet even as they argued, their eyes were drawn back to the roof and the way it shed the water, so simply. They realized that the human had not created the shelter, but his people had built it long ago, and that meant this was not a trick of one individual, but a way of life shared by an entire species. The thought left them speechless. The longer they watched Thomas, the more their fear shifted into confusion and then into wonder. They thought about their own home worlds, where even the smallest environmental hazard was monitored and controlled by technology, where students were never left unshielded from the elements. On Earth, however, humans had grown up wrestling with storms and bending the land to their will. To sleep during thunder and rain was not defiance, it was routine. The aliens shivered, not from cold, but from realization. What they saw as disaster, humans saw as ordinary life. That difference explained more about humanity's reputation than all the lectures they had received in the academy. As they huddled under the roof, they began to whisper questions they had never considered. If humans could master storms with nothing more than wood and slope, what else could they endure? If one human could carve channels in the mud with his hands and guide rivers away, what could an entire human city accomplish? The storm still raged outside, but under the shed the aliens felt something even more powerful than fear. They felt the beginnings of respect, a respect tinged with unease, for they were only beginning to understand how deeply humanity's resilience ran. And as Thomas leaned his head against the wall and drifted toward sleep, they realized that the lesson had only just begun: alien debate. The storm outside did not weaken, and the sound of rain drumming on the roof became a steady rhythm that filled the shelter with a constant reminder of the chaos beyond. The alien students sat in a circle beneath the sloped roof, their bodies still trembling from the ordeal. But their minds were now more restless than their limbs. Their wide eyes shifted between the falling sheets of water outside and the human, who sat calmly against the wall with his eyes closed, breathing evenly as if he truly intended to sleep while the world thundered around him. The contrast was unbearable to them, for they had grown up fearing even the hint of weather that could endanger fragile ecosystems, and now they were faced with a being who treated danger like background noise. Their fear slowly twisted into something else. An urgent need to understand. One student with shimmering scales lifted his head and spoke first, his voice shaking as he asked how it was possible that water falling from the sky could be considered harmless. To him, the storm was overwhelming, more destructive than anything he had ever experienced, yet the human treated it like nothing. A fur-covered student responded bitterly that perhaps humans had secret technology woven into their very clothing. Perhaps their uniforms were lined with hidden shields that deflected harm. But another alien, the insect-like student with drenched wings, shook her head fiercely and said she had seen Thomas kneeling in the mud with nothing but bare hands and a broken branch, guiding the water as though he knew its language. No technology could explain that. It had to be instinct or something even stranger. The debate grew louder as each student shared what they had witnessed. One with translucent skin argued that humans must carry some hidden adaptation in their bodies, some natural resistance to cold or drowning, for no creature could remain so calm in conditions that should be lethal. Another insisted that it was not biology but culture, that humans had spent so long on this hostile world, they had turned survival into a tradition passed from one generation to the next. They spoke of the simple sloped roof above them and how it turned a storm into safety, and they realized that this was not a rare innovation but something humans built everywhere as a matter of course. To the aliens, it seemed impossible that an entire species could live daily with hazards that would wipe out colonies on other worlds. And yet, here was the evidence. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes overlapping as panic returned in waves, sometimes pausing in awe as they remembered how Thomas had stood unshaken in the storm. They began to argue over whether humanity was a threat or a blessing to the galaxy. Some claimed that such resilience made humans dangerous, for if they could laugh at storms, then what else might they shrug off without fear? Others countered that such strength meant they could be allies unlike any other, capable of enduring hardships that would break entire civilizations. The debate was not just about the storm anymore, but about the nature of humanity itself, and whether the galaxy had underestimated them for too long. Thomas shifted slightly in his rest, and all voices fell silent at once. They waited to see if he would speak, but he only adjusted his position and exhaled softly before settling again. The aliens looked at one another, unnerved by the ease with which he ignored them, and the silence stretched until the insect-like student whispered that perhaps humans were not ignoring the galaxy at all, but simply living by their own rules, indifferent to whether others understood or not. The thought chilled them more than the rain ever could, for it meant humanity's strength was not something designed to impress or intimidate. It was simply who they were. The debate resumed with quieter tones now, their fear tempered by wonder. They compared this experience to lessons they had heard about other Deathworld species, but none matched the tales of humans. The stories had always sounded exaggerated, like myths told to frighten young cadets, but what they had seen today was undeniable. A storm that had nearly broken them was little more than an inconvenience to one human student who now rested as peacefully as if he were in a warm bed. Each alien considered what this meant for the balance of the galaxy. They had believed technology defined strength, yet here was a species proving that willpower and adaptation could equal or even surpass it. The rain outside began to lessen, the thunder moving further away, but none of the aliens dared to move from under the roof. They kept watching Thomas, each of them lost in thought, each of them weighing fear against respect. Their debate no longer had easy answers, for the lesson they had learned was too large to fit into neat arguments. Humans were not what they had been told. Humans were something else entirely. And as the storm began to fade, the alien students realized they had glimpsed only a fragment of a truth that could change how the galaxy saw Earth forever. Lessons in resilience. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, and the alien students sat huddled beneath the roof, staring out at the muddy field that only an hour ago had been their battlefield against nature. Their bodies still ached from the cold, their limbs heavy from the strain, but their minds were alight with thoughts they could not silence. Each of them replayed the chaos of the storm in their head, the panic, the desperation, and then the calm figure of the human who had walked through it all as if it were a familiar dance. Thomas stirred at last, opening his eyes slowly as if waking from a nap, stretching his arms before glancing at the aliens gathered around him. His expression held no arrogance, no triumph, only quiet amusement at the way they looked at him with such awe and confusion. One of the scaled students leaned forward and asked in a trembling voice how he had done it. How could he remain calm when the sky split apart with light and sound, when water fell in torrents as if the world itself was breaking? Thomas tilted his head, considering the question, then shrugged lightly and explained that humans had lived with storms like this for as long as they had existed. He told them that on Earth storms were not a punishment but a part of life, that even children learned to listen to the sky, to build roofs that shed the rain, to dig channels so the water would not drown their homes. To him it was not skill, but survival, not magic, but memory carried forward through generations. The aliens listened, their eyes wide, struggling to grasp the meaning. What he called ordinary was beyond their comprehension. The insect-like student raised her drooping wings and whispered that she had thought the storm would kill her. Thomas smiled faintly and said storms rarely killed those who respected them. He explained how humans learned not to fight against the elements but to work with them, to read the signs of clouds and wind, to prepare for what was coming rather than hide in fear. He pointed to the sloped roof above them and told them it was nothing more than clever design, a way to use gravity itself as a shield. The aliens turned their gaze upward again and for the first time saw not just wood and metal, but centuries of human adaptation embodied in something so simple. Another student asked why humans did not simply avoid such dangers, why they did not build domes to block the weather as other species had done. Thomas shook his head and said that on Earth there was no escape. The storms would come whether humans wanted them or not, and so they had chosen to adapt instead of hide. He spoke of villages that endured floods, of cities built to withstand hurricanes, of families that passed down knowledge of how to survive in lands that others would call uninhabitable. His voice was steady, and though he was young, the weight of countless ancestors spoke through him. The aliens felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain, for they realized that humanity's strength came not from one generation, but from countless generations who had refused to bow before a hostile world. They began to whisper among themselves, again, but their words carried no panic now. They spoke of what it meant to face danger every day until it no longer felt like danger at all. They spoke of how their own worlds had sheltered them from hardship, and how that shelter had left them fragile when true adversity arrived. In contrast, humans had been forged by struggle, tempered like steel until storms were nothing but background noise. The aliens shivered at the thought, realizing that the galaxy had underestimated Earth not because it was violent, but because it was relentless, and its people had become relentless to match. Thomas looked around at them and saw the mix of fear and respect in their eyes. He told them gently that what they had experienced today was only a small taste of life on Earth, that there were storms far greater, mountains that split the skies, oceans that could swallow fleets, and deserts that could burn the life out of any creature unprepared. Yet humans had found ways to live in all of them. His words fell like stones into their minds, sinking deep and stirring ripples of thought. They realized then that humanity's reputation was not built on stories or exaggeration, but on truth, a truth they had felt in their bones when the storm had nearly broken them. As the drizzle outside faded into mist, the aliens sat in silence, reflecting on the lesson they had just been given. Their fear of the storm was slowly replaced by something more profound, the understanding that resilience was not about strength alone, but about endurance, about bending without breaking, about finding ways to live where others could not. Humanity had mastered that art, and the galaxy had only begun to glimpse what it truly meant. The alien students knew they would never forget this day, for in their terror they had seen the heart of humanity revealed, and it was both humbling and terrifying in equal measure, awakening respect. The morning arrived slowly, pale light stretching across the wet ground and reflecting off puddles that had formed overnight. The alien students stirred from their uneasy sleep beneath the sloped roof, each of them looking around with wary eyes as if expecting another storm to descend without warning. But the sky was calm, clouds drifting lazily and the air carrying only the faint scent of damp earth. Thomas had already risen, sitting cross-legged at the edge of the shelter, his hands resting lightly on his knees, and watching them with quiet patience. There was no hurry in him, no need to push the moment, for he knew the lesson would reach them in its own time. One of the younger alien students, the one with translucent skin that glowed faintly under the morning light, approached cautiously and asked what humans did after a storm like that. Thomas smiled softly and told them that humans did not panic, that the aftermath was as natural as the storm itself. They assessed the damage, repaired what needed repair, and carried on with life. He described how rivers were redirected, mudslides cleared, roofs patched, and families reunited, each act small but part of a larger rhythm of existence. The alien students listened with rapt attention, realizing for the first time that survival was a continuous effort, a chain of small decisions that created strength over time. The largest alien, with armored plates that reflected the weak sunlight, shifted uneasily and admitted that their worlds never demanded such endurance. They were used to controlled environments, regulated weather, and predictable life cycles. Thomas nodded, acknowledging that their caution had served them well where they came from, but reminded them that unpredictability could be the true test of a species. He spoke of how humans had lived in deserts where sandstorms could strip flesh from bone, in frozen wastelands where snow could bury a city overnight, and on islands where volcanoes could erupt without warning. Humans had adapted because they had no choice, and adaptation had become instinct, a way of seeing obstacles not as threats but as opportunities to survive. The alien students shifted in their places, the weight of realization settling on them. They had come to learn about humans and expected stories of weapons, of cunning, of dominance. But they had found something far more profound, a species that had learned to endure everything the universe could throw at it, and still thrive. Thomas stood then, brushing the damp dirt from his clothes, and invited them to follow him outside. The ground was soft and sticky, the puddles deep, but he moved confidently, tracing channels in the mud with a stick to show how water could be directed and managed. He explained that even the smallest actions could prevent disaster, that knowledge applied with care could turn nature from enemy to ally. The alien students followed, imitating his movements, their initial clumsiness slowly replaced by understanding. They began to see the connections between action and result, between observation and outcome. The insect-like student marveled at how simple modifications in the soil could prevent floods, and the scaled one realized that planning and foresight could turn vulnerability into safety. Thomas encouraged them, gently correcting mistakes and praising ingenuity, letting them experience firsthand what it meant to shape the world rather than be crushed by it. Their respect for him deepened, not just for his skill but for the human way of thinking, of seeing possibilities where others saw only danger by the afternoon. The alien students had stopped speaking nervously and began to share ideas among themselves, devising methods for drainage, sloped shelters, and protective barriers for their own species. Thomas listened quietly, offering guidance but allowing them to explore and fail and try again. He explained that learning from mistakes was the human way, that resilience was built not by avoiding failure, but by embracing it and using it to grow stronger. The storm that had terrified them now seemed a distant memory, replaced by an understanding of endurance and cleverness, a respect for a species that thrived not because of raw power, but because of foresight, preparation, and unyielding persistences. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the wet field. The aliens gathered beneath the sloped roof once more, not out of fear this time, but to reflect on what they had learned. Thomas looked at them and said softly that the galaxy had misunderstood humanity, that strength was not always measured in weapons or fleets, but in the quiet, relentless ways a species could survive anything. The alien students nodded, their earlier panic replaced by admiration and contemplation. They had come to mock and judge, but they left with eyes opened and minds expanded, knowing that humans carried a power that was subtle, enduring, and terrifying in its persistence. They had witnessed it firsthand, and the lesson would remain with them forever. The rain that had defined their first encounter had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and silent, except for the soft drip of water from the roof. The alien students finally understood what it meant to face nature and not just survive but adapt and thrive, to turn fear into knowledge, and danger into opportunity. Thomas leaned back against the wooden post, eyes closed, content, while the aliens worked quietly around him, practicing, planning, and learning. Humanity had shown them what true resilience looked like, and the galaxy would be forever changed in their perception. Humanity's quiet triumph. The night had fallen soft and heavy over the small settlement, and the alien students, huddled under the sloped roof, listening to the wind sigh through the trees and the faint trickle of water Thomas had dug to guide the storm away from their shelter. They had expected chaos and fear to linger, but instead there was calm, a strange calm that settled over them like a lesson unspoken yet understood. Thomas moved among them slowly, his presence steady and reassuring, showing them that even in the wildest storms, humans did not panic, that they worked with patience and intelligence, that every action, no matter how small, had purpose and power. One of the smallest aliens with eyes like liquid silver reached out hesitantly to touch the shallow trenches Thomas had carved in the earth, and asked quietly why humans always seemed ready for disaster. Thomas explained without hurry that preparation was not about knowing the future, but about respecting the present, that humans watched nature closely and learned its rhythms, that they built not for pride, but for survival, and that each choice, whether digging a drain, reinforcing a roof, or studying the weather, was a promise to endure and to continue no matter what the universe sent their way. The larger aliens shifted uneasily and admitted that their species relied on strength and technology, but had little patience for foresight. Thomas nodded, understanding that adaptation was a skill learned through experience, not bestowed through invention. He told them that humans had faced plagues that could wipe cities from the map, had survived volcanic eruptions, freezing blizzards, and endless wars, and that their secret was always the same: calm determination, intelligence, and the willingness to act decisively, and then to wait and observe and act again. The alien students worked through the night, alongside Thomas, reinforcing the shelter, guiding the water into clever channels, and laying out plans to prevent flooding. And as they did, they began to understand the quiet power of resilience, the human way of turning panic into action, fear into knowledge, and danger into opportunity. They spoke little, but their eyes shone with new respect and comprehension, realizing that survival was not about terror or rage, but about ingenuity, courage, and patience. Morning came, pale and quiet, and the storm clouds had disappeared, leaving a world washed clean with puddles reflecting the rising sun. Thomas stepped back and watched the aliens examine the work they had done with him, each one moving carefully, learning how the smallest adjustments could change outcomes, how careful thought combined with steady action could save lives and resources. And he realized that the lesson had taken root in their minds, that they would never forget the night they had panicked in the rain, and the human who had shown them a better way to live and endure. The alien students gathered at the edge of the shelter, looking out over the drained fields and safe ground, and for the first time they felt awe, not at firepower or technology, but at the resilience of a species that seemed ordinary yet had mastered the art of survival. They understood that humans were unpredictable, not because they were reckless but because they were adaptable, and that their strength was subtle, patient, and unyielding, a quiet triumph that no storm could wash away, and no enemy could conquer. Thomas smiled softly, watching them process the revelation that humans were not just fighters or builders, but thinkers, observers, learners, and doers all at once, and that the galaxy had underestimated the quiet power that allowed humanity to endure. Through every trial, the alien students nodded silently among themselves, aware that they had been shown a truth far greater than any lecture or simulation, that they had been witnesses to something fundamental about life and survival. The storm had ended. The shelter stood strong, and the aliens now knew that no matter what chaos the universe might bring, humanity would find a way to adapt, overcome, and thrive. They had seen fear turned into action, patience turned into knowledge, and obstacles transformed into opportunity. And the lesson would echo in their minds long after they left the small rainy field they had arrived on in panic. The end.